Started. Hi, my name is Shiver, Academic Program Manager in the Office of Undergraduate Research. I organize the Undergraduate Research Education Series, one of the events that you're attending right now. And so a couple of pieces of housekeeping. If you are attending this event in real time and you're doing it as part of your Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program attendance requirement, you don't have to fill out an evaluation form. Your login to the event currently is your attendance. We've got that recorded, that's fine. I am gonna drop a link to the evaluation in the chat in just a few minutes though. Your feedback is always appreciated. It's optional, but it's really great to hear from you in terms of how things went and what you saw as being beneficial. And then I'm gonna start us off with a land acknowledgement. The American Indian Resource Center leads the way for me to acknowledge that the land that the University of Utah resides on has always been on Indigenous lands, specifically on the lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. I encourage you all to think about the Indigenous peoples of whatever land you're on today if you're not currently in Salt Lake City as well. It's imperative that we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Through this land acknowledgement, I want to express my personal gratitude and appreciation for their persevering to protect this land for future generations. The erasure of this relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands is an insidious form of ongoing colonization, and we need to build our mindfulness of this and other Indigenous protocols. And of course, in my opinion, the best way to respect Indigenous peoples would be to give the land back. And with that, we have Dr. José Gutiérrez here from the Department of Education, Culture, and Society, my very own advisor. So I'm very excited to have him join us for the education series today and talk to us about math education. I've already forgotten the title to the event. Math education. So Dr. Gutiérrez, take it away.
Thank you so much. Shiver, I just want to start by thanking you for inviting me to this forum. I'm excited to give this talk. I'm a little nervous as well for a variety of reasons. The first of which is I love talking about issues in math education. I've been passionate about math education, and math education research for a significant part of my life. And so a lot of the talk that you're going to hear is very personal to me, and my own experiences with both being a learner of mathematics and then also being an instructor of mathematics at various times deeply informs my work. And I use any opportunity that I have to work directly with kids and with youth. I use that as kind of like my the place where I explore different ideas that I'm developing in my academic life. So I'm going to share my screen, and then the title should pop up there. So when I was thinking about how to organize this this kind of this presentation, it's a talk about math education. So there's not going to be a whole lot of math in it. I want to see if I can just give you like the big picture right away, because I tend to kind of pull on a lot of threads and I like to go into the weeds, and I want us to kind of have an anchor for us, a conceptual anchor for us to kind of revisit should I ever get lost. So the name of the title, or the name of my talk is When the Antidote is the Poison, Current Research on Social Justice and Mathematics Education. Full disclosure, I came up with the title before I came up with the talk. I've had this intuition, and the things that I've been learning and the things that have been taught to me as a person, like I said, who's deeply invested in and passionate about math and math education, is maybe more math, more mathematics education, more math research is not the solution to equity and diversity and social justice in math education and beyond. So I'm going to explore some of those ideas. Like, what do I mean by that? Like, just to kind of, again, just to forefront the argument, access to high quality math education has been identified as a significant target for social justice movements, for social justice agendas, specifically because math at the secondary level and even at the primary level has been documented repeatedly as a gatekeeper to higher education. And higher education is the one thing that is believed to give kids and communities a chance at, economic stability, social mobility, overall health and well-being. And so the connection between math as gatekeeper and the life prospects of kids is well documented, and that connection is really robust. And so when we look at algebra in particular, algebra education as the gatekeeper to higher level mathematics and to higher education, one of the proposed solutions is, well, we need to provide more math, right? We need to provide kids with more courses on math topics, or we need to take Algebra 1 and extend it over 1 or 2 years. We need to provide algebra earlier, right? And so I don't know if folks remember this, but there was a big push in the early 2000s to mandate algebra in 8th grade. And so there were some states that took that up and really followed through on that mandate and made it a requirement. And other states kind of didn't take up that mandate or didn't take up that suggestion. And we'll talk a little bit about the effects of that. So my name is José Gutiérrez, and I am an assistant faculty in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society. And I want to give a big shout out to my department. They are the perfect education department for me. And if you ever want to stop by, we're in the Sorensen Arts and Education Complex. We are finding ourselves there in person more and more these days. So stop by and say hi. So for today's talk, I'm going to very briefly, again, go over in very broad brushstrokes. I'm not going to provide a lot of detail, but I'm going to go over my personal math story and just give you a little bit of more background about myself as a human being, as a math learner, and then also as a math ed researcher. And then I'm going to give a brief primer on research in math education. And then we're going to engage this question: should there be less math education, right? With all of these policies and initiatives to provide more or stronger opportunities for mathematics, my colleague Nero Shah has asked, well, wait a minute, why is there so much compulsory math education to begin with? What would happen if we provided less math education in the curriculum? So my personal math story, there are these moments that stick out to me in my K-12 education. For example, I remember, and keep in mind, I didn't have the language to describe my experiences back then, but I remember the sensation, and now I have the ideas and the language to describe maybe what I was feeling at the time. And so my earliest memories of math in school involve, the ones that stick out to me are in 7th grade, and I was taking pre-algebra. And I remember being one of very few students of color in this pre-algebra class. And out of all the things that my teacher said that year, one thing that they said was they made a comment about how my friends who were not in pre-algebra, they made a comment that suggested that they would be like nobody, right? That they were on a different track, right? So there was already I was already getting messages of social hierarchy in mathematics. I was already getting messages about my self-worth, about my associations, my relationships. And again, I didn't have this kind of language or this kind of interpretation of that experience. I just remember what she said and how it felt. And so the next kind of moment that kind of stood out to me, like I knew, like growing up, I wasn't really hyper aware, right? Like socially or politically, like I knew I wasn't white, but I didn't think I was brown. I was just kind of like in this liminal space, and I got a lot of messages around that, especially in my math classes. When I got to high school, I was one of very few students of color in Algebra 2 as a 9th grader. And again, the messaging that I got there was very subtle, but it was clear, right? Like I was on a different path than the people who were not enrolled in these classes, right? And so those kinds of things really, really stuck with me. And I didn't make much of them at the time, but like I said, they kind of stuck with me. Fast forward the tape a little bit. In my early 20s, I started attending a community college, and I enrolled in a bunch of math classes, and I really fell in love with mathematics. Long story short, I studied math as an undergrad. I thought I was going to be a mathematician, but it turns out I did not. Again, I noticed race and I noticed gender in my upper division math classes at UCLA, but I didn't have any sort of tools to analyze what I was feeling or what I was experiencing at the time. I did kind of face some denigrating experiences where people were making like some racist comments. I remember one time a friend of mine at the time, was my friend, he mentioned how maybe there was like some genetic mutation in my lineage that enabled me to be able to learn mathematics at a high level, you know, because other, you know, Mexicans or Mexican Americans were, you know, were not capable of learning, right? Like math at this kind of like high level. And I just remember thinking like, man, that's really messed up, but also, man, that could be true. Like I'm special, right? Like maybe I am intellectually superior, right? And so again, I don't have any critical analysis of any of these things. I'm just kind of like living my math life kind of raw. And this narrative, I started to internalize it. I started to internalize this narrative of myself as superior, myself as different from my family, different from my community. And these were the messages that I was getting fed to me about a hierarchy. And I drank the Kool-Aid, right? It made me feel good, right? It made me feel good to think of myself as mathematically or intellectually different than my peers. This had very negative effects on myself and on my family and my community. It turns out that I didn't have enough prepared, like I wasn't prepared enough to kind of pursue graduate studies. And I took this lack of experience or limited experience with a lack of fundamental ability, right? And so I conflated, you know, any sort of skill or aptitude that I had for really trying to learn math with some genetic, innate, like invariant property, right? And so I figured, oh, I'm just not a high level math person. I'm gonna go teach math, right? And then from teaching math, I got into math education research. So I developed a very problematic and troubling math identity. And at times, and it was rooted in racist narratives about intelligence and communities of color. Another thing that I want to say is I didn't know this at the time, but there was a few years where I really drove a wedge, my attitude, right, towards math and towards my intelligence and towards my, like the fact that I was one of the very few people in my extended family to pursue higher education. This really inflated my ego, right? And I didn't know how to handle it. And so it drove a wedge between myself and my immediate family, my extended family. I was just really annoying to be around, right? Like I was walking around like I was better than everybody. It was just like a part of it was institutional, but part of it was just me and my attitude, right? The last thing I'll say about my math journey is my odyssey as a math education researcher kind of parallels my experiences as a math learner and as a math educator, right? My initial interest in doing research was based on cognition, right? I wanted to understand the cognitive factors that impacted mathematical learning, right? In a sense, I was doing like research. I wanted to know why I wasn't smart enough to do math, right? And I wanted to study that from a cognitive level because I was, again, I drank the Kool-Aid and I thought like this, I thought cognitive science was going to save math education. As my career kind of evolved and as I matured as an individual and as a scholar, I started to ask questions around race and racism in mathematics education. I started to ask questions around identity. And again, all of this is informed by my own experiences as a learner and a teacher. And now my most current research projects are actually historical in nature. Like I'm going back and I'm looking at the history of math education and the history of the math curriculum. But at the same time, I try to work with local teachers in developing community-based math initiatives, right? What are some different ways that we can bring kids and families together around mathematics? I would love to say more about that, but I'm gonna focus this talk on a different part of math education and not necessarily, I might circle back to that, but I want to focus on something else. So I realized that because this is the seminar for undergraduates who are becoming more and more familiar with research and with higher education, I wanted just to give a brief primer on the history of math education and math education research. So in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik into space, and the US was like, oh my goodness, we are not the world's superpower. We are falling behind intellectually, technologically, militarily, economically. Like we ain't having that, right? So the first and primary motivation to develop math education research and to improve math education was motivated by economic production and preparation for the military, right? And so our first efforts into developing math education as a field were motivated by, imperialist, capitalist kinds of sentiments, right? In terms of, so this was the first motivation for developing math education. As more and more critical scholars started to, I'll use the word infiltrate math education and the field of education broadly, we started to ask questions around about equity and representation and access to mathematics. So fast forward the tape from the 1950s, 1960s to circa, mid 80s, early 90s, there's a huge focus. Equity in math education at that time dealt a lot with access to mathematics and, increasing enrollment in higher level courses for student populations historically disenfranchised by public education. And so one aspect of this equity access focused work is standardized testing in mathematics. I don't know how it is in Utah, I should know this, but in California, about a third of the content of the standardized test in mathematics that's required for high school graduation, about a third of that content is algebra content. And so algebra specifically and geometry became a well-known hurdle that teachers and students had to overcome at the secondary level. And so this became a huge focus for research and for policy and the like. One solution that was proposed is, well, let me back up. Even before the mandates started coming out in the early 2000s, Bob Moses was an activist, political activist and educator. And Bob Moses won the MacArthur Genius Award to start the Algebra Project. And the Algebra Project is a community-based initiative that seeks to increase access to mathematics for historically disenfranchised youth, specifically Black and Brown students of color, and also Indigenous students of color. So the Algebra Project was happening in the early 2000s. At the same time, policymakers were pushing for more algebra earlier. And so the sequence kind of looks like this. Geometry and trig are in there somewhere, right? But the sequence kind of looks like this. These are the cut points in the math curriculum, right? This is where students and teachers typically get caught up, right? This is where the challenges begin. In arithmetic, in algebra, geometry, and so on, and further on in calculus. So one proposed solution was, algebra is a huge gatekeeper. We need to teach algebra earlier in the curriculum, right? So there was a huge investment in resources and policy to just move algebra earlier. One of the critiques of this, though, is that not a lot of resources were provided. No, there wasn't an expansive kind of program to support teachers to teach algebra on a large scale in 8th grade. There was nothing else to support students to learn algebra at that level. And also there was very little done for community support and community engagement as well. So there was a lot of problems with those kinds of initiatives to begin with. One of the things that I took up for this talk is I wanted to know a little more detail about, okay, what were the impacts of moving algebra earlier in the curriculum. And just as a side note, there's also like a mini movement within math ed research. It's called early algebra. And this is a cadre of folks who are trying to introduce algebraic concepts and algebraic learning even earlier, right? Like at the pre-K or elementary level. They're arguing that young kids can learn or engage in algebraic-ish kinds of reasoning at a very young age. And so this kind of overlaps a little bit with the Algebra for All movement. Okay, so one of the things that I learned some more details on, there was a report from the Brookings Institute in 2013, and I apologize, there may be some more up-to-date research on this and what's happened in the last, 7 years or so. But in that report, they showed that universal policies for algebra in 8th grade had a neutral effect, meaning there was no increase in performance, or in some instances, they had a negative effect. And Dr. William Tate, at Washington University in St. Louis, used a variety of quantitative data sources to elaborate on these kinds of arguments a little bit more. And Dr. Tate was actually arguing in 2019, and even before that, that more algebra and more what was referred to as high cognitive demand math tasks, right? If you front load these early on, there's actually negative effects for Black and brown kids broadly, right? And so one of the first findings, again, is boosting algebra enrollment in 8th grade did not have any impact on overall performance. Dr. Tate argues that school climate got worse. When these initiatives started coming out, there was a correlation between negative school climate and increased math and increased cognitive demand in mathematics. He also noticed that increased school discipline, especially with students of color, there was also a positive correlation there. And then also there was an increased dropout or pushout rate for high school students. And he's theorizing and arguing that it's because of the worsened school climate and the worsened school atmosphere that surrounds mathematics. And then not only that, these initiatives, again, keep in mind, these initiatives came out because they were viewed as a way to provide access to higher education, right? We need to support kids through the math sequence and then support them onto college. The main reason for doing that is because a lot of the research that came out before these mandates showed that if students took Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 in high school, that was the strongest indicator that they would then go on and pursue some sort of college education, right? And if a student took Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and geometry, if they completed those in high school, their chances of actually enrolling in and completing graduation were significantly higher, right? So people were really targeting math as a way to higher education. And here, Dr. Tate is saying there was no change in college enrollment, right? There was no net gain or net benefit as a result of those national mandates. To further the argument, Dr. Tate is arguing that the problem is not math per se or math education per se, but it's massive funding disparities in education. And so, okay, there's gonna be a lot of text. I suggest not reading it. I just wanted it for the video. But there's gonna be a lot of text. And so I'm just gonna talk you through the text and I'm gonna read the text in purple. So Dr. Tate is arguing that one of the strongest predictors of academic achievement in general, not just mathematically, but in general, is whether or not a child and the child's family has access to healthcare, right? Does the child have health insurance? Do the child's guardians and family have health insurance? If so, they are way more likely to take advantage of those services. And those are also highly correlated with the child having all the other resources that they need to engage in successfully in their education. And so when I received this message, I was at a conference for math educators, and William Tate had a conference room full of math educators. This is 2019, before the pandemic. And here he is saying, if you really wanted to have a high cognitive demand with mathematics, the best thing we can do is not research more math. It's not come up with another teaching technique. It's to provide children and their families with healthcare. So this opened up a space for me and for the field to talk about, okay, what is the role of math education in achieving racial equity and social justice broadly? Again, my colleague, Dr. Nirav Shah, at the same conference, he posed the question to us, should there be less math education, right? And he posed some things to consider. So if we had less math education, right? Now think about this. Math is a compulsory topic in the life of a child for many, many years. Why is that? Does it necessarily need to be like that, right? Or at least that much. And so he proposes, if we had less mathematics education, what could we do with that newly open space in the curriculum? And he provides some alternatives. These are just a few. I bet that the audience here can come up with a few other suggestions on what we can do with this newly open space, right? If we didn't have 10 years of required math, what if we only had 5 or 6 years of required math? He's saying we can develop curriculum to teach students about, for example, voter suppression tactics, politics of indigenous sovereignty, sorry, the I should be capitalized there, climate change, healthcare reform, among a whole host of other social and cultural issues that we could fit into the curriculum if math wasn't required. Some more things to consider. In addition to the quantity of math, there's also the question of quality. And this is sort of where my work, where I try to contribute to this kind of realm in math education. So we're also considering the recent trends in math education are looking at different models of math education that are informed by radically different philosophies and ethics, if you will. So I just want to point you very, very briefly to the field of critical mathematics writ large. For a really good review, you can see the work of Brentlinger, wrote a really good review in 2011. And again, some of these are a little dated and the field has come a long way since, but this is just like a sample of some of the work that's out there. Ethnomathematics, Umberto D'Ambrosio recently passed away, but was a huge proponent in the idea that Western mathematics dominates not only the field of mathematics, but dominates math education, and the mathematical practices and the norms. Sorry, let me back up. Whereas the mathematical principles and concepts may be universal, right? Like, for example, the sum of the interior angles of a triangle, right, on a Euclidean plane. If I add them up here in Salt Lake City, it's going to equal 180, right? If someone in South Africa does the same kind of task, the sum of the interior angles is always going to equal 180, right? And so these properties may be universal, but the experience of teaching and learning these mathematical properties are always locally situated and culturally informed. And so D'Ambrosio is arguing that we need to look at the local kind of like practices and the culture that surrounds math teaching and learning. Dr. Rochelle Gutiérrez is building on this work plus a whole bunch of other work to kind of advance this philosophy, what she refers to as mathematesh. And this is a philosophy that builds on and extends ethnomathematics, critical mathematics, but also adds some indigenous epistemology and other kinds of sentiments and ideas that are coming from critical race theory and intersectional feminism. At the heart of these first three, I believe, is the need for community-based initiatives, right? I think what all of these scholars are asking is what else is possible, right? If we have a group of kids together and we're going to talk about math and we're going to learn, maybe try to learn some mathematics, what else is possible other than the dominant or traditional ways of delivering math content to students? And so this is where some of my work takes place. Like I said, I look for any opportunity I have to work with youth directly on mathematics. I look for opportunities to work with local teachers and to help them develop a vision for how they can do math differently in their classroom. Sometimes this involves, it's a very simple idea, right? It's kind of like a science fair, although it's not a science fair, it's better than a science fair, where we invite the guardians and the parents to come to school, and the students kind of show them like some of the math projects they've been working on. And another thing that I try to do is I try to support teachers in coming up with projects or units, instructional units that actually involve social justice in mathematics, right? How do we support students, middle school students and high school students, to ask questions that are important to them and then use mathematics to pursue those topics? Again, this isn't anything new or groundbreaking. People have been talking about these topics and been using these approaches in math ed for a number of years. I'm just bringing them to the table now and as an introduction, right, to this space. Okay, but where's all of this going? Again, like I said at the top of my presentation, my odyssey, if you will, my journey in math ed research really parallels my experiences as a learner and as an educator in mathematics. And so now where I am, in a lot of ways, is indicative of where the field is. Now, I'm not saying that I represent the state of the art. What I'm saying is that I'm deeply affected by what's happening in the field, right? And who I surround myself with. And so now I surround myself with people who are developing their scholarship in ethnic studies, in indigenous studies, in the social foundations of schooling, in critical race theory, intersectional feminism, right? These are the people that I'm learning from and in conversation with. And so this is a kind of sorry, I'll hold this comment for the next slide. I just remembered I had a slide for this. So as a field, we want to keep growing and we want to keep expanding by moving away from, not moving away, but building on the work that was done earlier on access and achievement. But now we want to look at identity and we want to look at power dynamics. And so in order to do that, we're looking at fields that have historically been doing that a lot longer than educational researchers and math educators have been doing. For example, ethnic studies, social foundations, history, and even legal scholarship. Another area that is starting to grow within the math ed scholarship is that people are looking at activists and social movements and trying to learn from them on how math can like harm reduction, like how can we reduce the harm that math education causes, for example, to communities of color, and then also how can we use math education as a setting to resist some of these known hierarchies and systems of oppression. So what can we learn from people who are outside of academia, right? Artists, activists, writers, things like that. I blocked my screen. Move this. And again, just to kind of try to bring everything together, the current trends and future avenues in math education research. Let's keep building. We have to keep looking at issues of access and achievement. Representation is important. Who is enrolling in, for example, in our math department at the U is important. Who is enrolling? Can we keep them, right? Can we provide a nurturing and supportive environment for students, who come from, racial, gender, and sexually diverse backgrounds, right? Like, can we be as inclusive as possible? And so this area of research is still very much important, right? Looking at student identity and looking at how, my view of myself and my view of my family are not independent of my experiences in mathematics, right? So doing a deeper dive at issues of student identity, humanizing, dehumanizing practices, and those sort of studies are really important and much needed. So looking at power dynamics, when I was, I'm gonna look at this time here. Okay, I'm gonna talk for 3 more minutes. Shiva, if I talk for more than 3 minutes, just kick me off. When I was in grad school, like I said, I lived kind of a double life. I was really intrigued by cognitive science, and I really believed that like science and positivist research in general can solve the achievement gap, right? Like we just needed to do more sciencey stuff with math learning, right? But like I said, I was living a double life because what I was being taught in my graduate studies didn't match what I felt as a kid and didn't match what I was observing in the classrooms there in the Bay Area in California when I was kind of doing my pilot studies, working with teachers in classrooms, right? There was something that was going on. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I just called it power dynamics, but at the time I thought of power in a very sanitized or neutral way. I didn't have the language or the tools to think about it in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of language, anything like that, right? But I just called it power, right? And I for my dissertation and my graduate work, I tried to advance a definition of social power dynamics that was rooted in cognition. I said what I said, I wrote what I wrote, and it's there, but now I'm moving on to other conceptions and frameworks of power. And again, like I said, I am drawing on the scholarship that has been doing this for a really long time, right? Ethnic studies, sociology, political science to some extent. Recently, there are articles that are coming out that are they're speaking to my soul, right? And so what 20, 30 years ago, math education was borrowing from these other fields, right? It's an interdisciplinary field, but we're consuming and borrowing from other fields to develop our theory and develop our methodology. It really makes me happy to see that people are theorizing theories of learning, theories of math learning as theories of society. And so now I think what's happening is people are starting to realize that the methods developed specifically within math ed can be used, for example, in critical discourse analysis or in conversation analysis. Because a really common method in studying mathematics learning is to look very carefully at line by line interaction, right? I'm talking about student verbal utterance, gesture, movement. These kinds of methods for analyzing micro moments of learning are now getting used to interpret and understand, interpret these moments of learning as moments of the exercise of power. This has been done for a long time in education and in other fields. Fred Erickson has been doing this. He's been writing about this for a long time. But there's aspects of this work where math education can make unique contributions to developing theories of society and theories of power. Again, another area that I think we need more work on is student activism in mathematics, right? How can we support students to ask and pursue their own questions related to social justice? There's more work. There's a growing body of work, but we still need more work on gender and sexual diversity in not only in math, but in math and science broadly. And then also an ECS student recently turned me on to the work of Vincent Basile, who's looking at the connection, who's looking at decriminalization practices in STEM settings, and is providing these models of very concrete things that teachers can do to as a type of like harm reduction, right? It's like, okay, sorry, I also meant to put here Erica Bullock, since we're on video. This is great. I'm also deeply moved by the work of Erica Bullock, who's been looking at the connection between math education and the school to prison pipeline, the school to prison nexus. And so all of this work, there is a lot of indirect evidence that connects math and mathematical practices with these broader movements, right? Or these broader social disparities, such as high incarceration rates for students of color. And so we're starting to bring in those ideas and tackle them directly in our scholarship, but more can be done, right? Like what does this mean for teachers, on Monday, right? Like how can I enact these ideals that are informed by these larger theories? How can I enact them as a teacher, as an educator? I think that's all I have. Yeah, questions?
So we do want to open it up to questions from the audience. We have one already submitted in the chat. It's a clarification question, so we're going to start with that one. And it's from several slides back when you were talking about the requirements in California, I think. So they just wanted to clarify that there's an exam for graduating high school.
At the time, there was a standardized exit. They're called exit exams in high school. I believe since then they may have done away with them. I'm not sure. But at the time that I was growing up and at the time that I was doing my research in the early 2000s, these were high stakes exams. Like, I mean, if you didn't pass these exams, it didn't matter what your grades were at your high school. You weren't granted, the district wasn't allowed to grant you a high school diploma. You can get waivers, but it was a long process and you had to know about these things. But this was the exit exams for high school were the bane of many children and their families' existence. And I had a lot of my work in the early 2000s had nothing to do with actually doing math or tutoring kids with math. It was just about consoling their families, right? And then like trying to talk them about, what this means for them and what this means for their child and their future.
We have another question in the chat now. So when working with local teachers, what do you most often recommend to them in developing their curriculum?
What I've done recently is I've worked with local teachers to negotiate space. And what I mean by space is, can they negotiate with their principal or their math department to teach a 2 to 4 week unit that has nothing to do with any standard, right? Just, can the kids just do something different with math? And again, this could be as simple as a math night. The students are given some open-ended math problem, and then they create a poster or some sort of artifact that kind of represents their work, and they invite their family, right? They invite their guardians, their parents, their siblings, and we feed them, right? We provide, one night we provided tamales, and it was just kind of an interesting way of doing that. The teachers that I work with, they actually extended that idea, and they had their middle school students come up with a fundraising project. So they came up with an auction based on a math activity, and they auctioned off these like geometric kind of artifacts, these lanterns, and they were able to raise over $500 as a school, and they donated this money to various organizations in Mexico and South America who focused on education, bringing resources and access to farmers and school supplies to rural communities and things like that. So that's kind of like the pressures that teachers feel is immense, right? Like carving out any sort of time is very precious, right? There's a lot of constraints on their practice. And so one of the first things that I try to do is, can we just carve out some time? Can we do this once a semester? Can we do this twice a semester, right? And it's building on these kinds of ideas and just giving them a little more autonomy. Whoa, look at all these questions.
I know. Okay, so what do you think the best course is for us undergraduates to go forward with this research, especially those of us who may not be close to teaching or math?
Just get involved. Get involved at the research end, but also get involved on the volunteer side. There's a lot of schools, there's a lot of organizations locally that are looking for good math tutors, right? They're just looking for people to be like a math person in their space, right? This could be an after school program. I know that West High, you can volunteer at West High. Well, not right now. I'm not sure if you can right now, but West High was always looking for volunteers. You can just come in, you can fill out the little form, and you can, talk to someone and they'll set you up. You can be an in-class tutor. I would just say, just get involved in whatever way you are interested in, however much time you have. And for me, like I've been building this up very, very slowly over the course of, I mean, I don't even know how long now, but yeah, there's some of the citations that I included just include like a lot of background information on critical mathematics. And again, I should say that I'm coming at this from a very biased perspective. Like I'm giving you the work that is coming out of, that is being developed by people who are specifically interested, for example, in anti-racist pedagogy, or interested in, critical theory in some form or fashion, right? And so this is a very narrow slice of the work in math education, right? But there's other kinds of things that are going on. So yeah, just poke around and see what comes of it.
It occurs to me that also, regardless of what area y'all all are focusing on, there's probably similar trends in thinking about the, power dynamics in different fields too. So if you're like, this talk was really interesting, but math, you could look into whatever field you're working in and see sort of the history of education and kind of how those power dynamics work, who's doing that critical work, and if there are any kind of local groups or faculty that you could work with, like in a discipline specific way. Okay, the next question. What can be done to combat negative self-images or negative sense of self-worth that can come from being discriminated against in math?
Oh, okay. I thought that question was going to stop before the being discriminated against, because the way I was starting to read it was what can be done to combat the negative self-images or negative sense of self-worth that math does to you, period, right? And then it also just so happens that people are discriminated against for a variety of reasons. It could be, due to racial perceptions, could be due to gender, could be due to a host of other social factors that are shaping the way that we experience the, mathematical spaces. The first thing I'll say, there's like this mythology around math, right? Like there are these beliefs that like, you're born with a math gene, right? Like if I can't solve a problem quickly, then it's unsolvable, or I can't solve it, right? So there are these associations with mathematical ability that are related to like speed, like how fast I can do math, how fast I can learn math. And then there's also like, mathematics, the field of mathematics is built on the male superiority myth. Like I'm thinking of the work of Luis Leiva, who is specifically trying to unpack this, right? Like the field of mathematics is no different than any other field of science, right? It's rooted in white supremacy and settler colonialism. And so what makes math and math education particularly good at hiding inequity is people believe it is inherently objective and culture-free. It's a culture-free practice, right? Because the content itself is universal and objective, the practices around that and the learning around that also are assumed to be objective, politically neutral, ahistorical, right? Like math and mathematical thinking are seen as like, they're kind of like Thor, they kind of like live above, they're like superhuman, right? But really they're not. They're mathematics, again, the concepts and ideas, there are mathematical concepts that are invariant, but my experience of learning those invariant concepts is subjective, right? It's me, right? And it's impacted and shaped by the people around me and the messages that I'm getting. I find you, in terms of like feeling like you don't fit in, or if you've actually been discriminated against, number one, like there are channels, like especially at the university level, there are channels to report, these kinds of, if there is an actual incident or a conflict, there are ways to report this. There are ways of kind of advocating for ourselves. And then on top of that, right, just surrounding yourself with your folks, like find your family, find your chosen family in mathematics. Working with undergrads. While I was in grad school, I was working with current undergraduate mathematics majors, And they constantly told me how they had to find their own little group of folks to work with and study with, right? And so find your chosen family within these mathematical spaces and kind of, stick together. I sort of had that, but it was, like I said, it was problematic at times. My relationships with my math peers were problematic at times.
Okay, so just wondering, I know that you're specialized in racial discrimination, but are you also experienced with discrimination against neurodiverse students, like people with ADHD or autism in mathematics?
I'm learning more and more about critical disability studies and how that intersects with mathematics. I don't know much, essentially zero. What I can say though is that there are these ideas that have been socially constructed and historically constructed around intelligence, around normativity, that mathematics kind of contributes to that. Like mathematics contributes to a dominant culture of the normal, right? Like there is a normal way of being, there is a normal way of thinking about things. The vast majority of people live within that. And then there are like the really like highly gifted math people, right? Who are like, again, they're like Thor, they're like above and beyond, like us mere mortals. So what I can say is that there is some scholarship that looks at how disability and perceptions of disability are co-constructed with notions of intelligence and notions of mathematical ability. And those are all deeply tied to the racist history of the United States, right? Like all of these kinds of areas are related in some form or fashion. Like if you look at the history of scientific racism in the US, right? All of these converge at some point. Now, what's interesting to observe, or what's interesting for me to notice, is that these things were out in the open, right? Like people were openly racist, openly, discriminatory. The DNA of that legacy of ours is now in the contemporary curriculum, but because it's been 50, 60 years since the last, well, I mean, not anymore. I mean, now that you have like these other things that are going on, right? So for a time, the waters, nobody was really splashing around. Like the organized white supremacist movement wasn't really splashing around, or if they did, they were in these small kind of like local regions. And then nationally, in the last year or so, things have kind of blown up. And so people are thinking about not the subtle ways that race and racism play out, but they're looking also at the overt ways that race and racism are playing out currently in education. And there might be a question around, like somebody asked around CRT, critical race theory, and the current ban.
There is, that was submitted beforehand, and we will get to that, but I want to get to the ones in the chat first. Would you mind expounding on the decriminalization practices in STEM? What is that?
So like I said, there's growing evidence that makes strong connections between math education, the outcomes of math education, and its connection with school discipline. And there's a strong literature that already connects patterns or trends within school discipline to students having encounters with the juvenile justice system, and then beyond with higher incarceration rates, for example, with Black boys and men, and men of color in particular, or more generally, I should say. And so we're starting to connect the dots, right? We're starting to connect the dots very slowly with our scholarship to make these connections more and more explicit. Decriminalization, my take on, again, this is a new area for me. I'm just starting to learn and read about this because I'm like a recovering positivist. I'm trying to engage more and more with these ideas and trying to ask myself, what do they mean for me? Decriminalization is both, it seems to me like both a harm reduction approach and then also a generative, expansive approach. I haven't done this work yet, but from what I can tell from Vincent and Basile's work is that there are these behaviors, like classroom behaviors and performances, if you will, cultural performances that are associated with Black and brown boys. And so those behaviors are often criminalized, right? Like students of color are often sent to the principal's office more. They are penalized more for the same kinds of overt performances or behaviors that other students who are not Black or brown, like for example, who are white students, or in the case of Vincent Basile's work, and I forget the other person who did the study. anyways, because of underlying racial bias, or I would even say racist views of kids of color, these kind of like movements, physical movements, or performances are punished instead of just viewed as like kids being kids, right? And so decriminalization provides a set of tools to reinterpret or to reframe what kids are doing in classrooms and to minimize their contact with any sort of disciplinary procedure, right? Because we all like the research is very clear on that. Once a child is placed on a disciplinary track, it's really hard to get them off, right? Like, and so our racist views, racist perceptions are feeding into those. In the moment, a teacher might think, oh, I'm just giving him a timeout. I'm just giving him, like they disrespected me, so they need to go to the teacher's office. Dr. William Tate gives a powerful argument about how the notion of disrespect when a teacher feels disrespected, for example, by a Black child, that overlaps very strongly with the laws that were in place that were used to imprison Black men, right? And if you look at the list of things that Black men could be imprisoned for, at the root of all of them were disrespect, right? Like insubordination, talking back, all these kinds of things. And so theoretically, there's a lot of interpretive work that is making very strong connections between the carceral state and math education. But like I said, we need more direct evidence. We need more direct scholarship to actually forge these connections so that we can give policymakers something new to work with, right? Like if we can amass enough evidence, maybe we can garner enough motivation to really rethink what we're doing with math and math education.
Okay. Do you think that some of the negative effects of early algebra could be improved by a more individualized mathematics education? Working as a tutor, I've noticed a lot of dissolution and apathy and feelings of inadequacy in students pressured into courses too advanced for them, but a similar disposition existed in students in courses too easy for them as well.
It's a long question. Try to read it. I'm not sure. I guess I'm not quite understanding the question, right? Like I guess part of it is I'm getting part of the problem with the algebra early was that if you make it a requirement to have all students enroll in algebra earlier, there are going to be some students who are more or less prepared, right? And so the students who are more prepared will benefit from the idea that, okay, they can benefit from math earlier, so they're going to matriculate down the line. But there are other students, due to lack of opportunity or maybe lack of resources or high quality education or teachers, just are not as familiar or as prepared to engage with the early algebra. Individualized, I don't have any strong opinions about whether kids should be off doing their own things on these individual tracks. I've never thought about that too much, so I'm sorry I can't I can't really speak to your question. It must be so unsatisfying. I'm very unsatisfied with the answer, but I will continue to think about it and look into it.
What are some resources for researching what a school or a school district is doing to combat these problems in math ed?
I can sort of answer that question, but I have another thought with the previous question. With regards to being a tutor, studies have also shown, right, both within math education and outside, one of the strongest ways to improve math learning and math performance is to provide one-on-one tutoring, right? So that's part of the problem with the dominant model of education. If you have one, let's imagine you have the most highly skilled, most experienced teacher, but if they're responsible for the learning of 30 kids, they can satellite around the room and provide one-on-one guidance, regularly, but the learning gains are not ever going to be as strong as sustained one-to-one guidance like you find in a tutoring relationship. And so that's another thing that I kind of have been looking into, is like, how do teachers, how do you optimize that in a classroom setting? Like, how do you optimize a teacher satelliting around the room and providing one-on-one guidance with students, and how do you do that in an equitable way? And then regards to the second question, so one of the some of the research that's coming out, I forget the authors. So one of the big findings in ed policy is that when you change like for example, with the Common Core, right? You can't just change the curriculum. You have to change other systemic aspects, right? You have to increase professional development. You have to prepare teachers to teach this new curriculum. You have to prepare students. There's a whole lot of things that have to go on whenever you change any aspect of schooling. And the thing that districts and educators, the mistake that they kept kind of making repeatedly is they would only attend to one aspect of the system, right? Like they would change the curriculum, or they would provide more opportunities for teacher professional development without any new updated materials, and so it's hard to kind of move the whole thing forward as a system. And there's a lot of work around that. Like some of the best reforms actually had a strong buy-in, not only by teachers, but by teachers, students, and district leaders. And so if there's strong buy-in, there's a greater likelihood that people will be provided with additional supports and actual monetary resources to implement some of these improvements. And they have been shown, like it can be done. It's just a Herculean task to do it.
All right, so I think Marina's hand was up first.
Hi, Marina.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the talk. This has been great listening to everything you've had to say about math education. But I guess I'm just kind of curious, like we sometimes see kind of these somewhat prevalent attitudes, unfortunately, of assumed hierarchies between STEM fields or even within STEM fields, wherein theoretical researchers feel that they are doing more significant work than experimental researchers, or for example, chemists feel that that their work is more important than biologists, and physicists feel their work is more important than chemists, and mathematicians sometimes feel that their work is perhaps more important than kind of all the other STEM fields combined, because they provide the foundation. So I'm just curious how you feel that this can contribute to, specifically with math, like gatekeeping, especially from an early age or early on in education, and how we can actually combat that particular kind of culture.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are hierarchies like all along the way, right? If you look at the degree attainment, I think physics is the field that is viewed as the most intellectually like difficult, right? Because of the number of degrees that are awarded in theoretical physics. It used to be mathematics, right? Like it used to be math and then physics and then engineering and then, all those things. But now I think the culture and the narratives around intelligence and like intellectual superiority are now like people are saying that physics, right, is like the highest, right? I think combating these hierarchies at every level is work that people can take up at like wherever they are, right? Like these hierarchies will look different for example, in a middle school math classroom on the West Side. These hierarchies are constructed differently because language there's a lot of language diversity, right? You have kids who are bilingual or even multilingual, right? And then so how do we, like, at one point in the US, right, if a child was learning English and emerging bilingual, they were placed in special education because they didn't have any bilingual education programs, right? And so there's all of these kind of like historical elements that are floating around a classroom. And so a hierarchy in a middle school math classroom could be rooted in like language, right? Like a child might feel insecure around their language ability around math. And so like, how do you bring students together to actually share those language resources, right? Like if one student knows Portuguese, another student knows Spanish, and another student knows French, which I've had in my class, I asked them like, hey, how do you say square? How do you say the quadratic? Look it up, like Google it, and kids have their phones, right? And so there's different ways of like addressing these perceived hierarchies using various kinds of like in the moment kinds of tactics. I also personally, because I was so deeply affected by the notion of intelligence in mathematics, I try not to ever say anything that associates math with intellectual ability or even with thinking, right? I try not to use the word thinking whenever I teach. Instead, I say like what did you do? How was this related to that? Show me what you did, right? You know, and so I use a lot of movement, a lot of gesture. And I, you know, because one thing that I observed in my graduate studies is teachers stand at the front of the board, right? And they're like, you know, after like the warm-up problem, they're like, who wants to tell me how they were thinking about this? And right, and so thinking is conflated with math practice. And so, and then in higher ed, I think it takes a little more, I don't know, most of my experience is in K-12, but I believe like building the culture and transforming the culture in higher ed takes a lot of work to kind of combat those hierarchies.
Thinking and demanding interdisciplinarity is one way that we can do that, right? Refusing to accept that things have to be siloed, but also that's hard. Okay, Morrison, you have your hand up.
It's also 12:30.
Sorry, I know we're out of time, so I'll just make this quick. So you kind of made me think about this when you were talking about, you know, one teacher being responsible for the learning of 30 students. Has there been any research into like kids helping other kids, or if that's detrimental and like contributes to superiority complexes or like negative self-images among kids who are getting help in the classroom from other kids?
Yeah, there's this great work coming out of Mexico and other parts of the world. The scholar's name is Macy. I'll write it in the chat. I think that's how you spell it. M-I-E, M-E-I? I tried my best. So there's some work coming out of Mexico in rural parts of Mexico. It's called tutoría. And this is where you have kids who, the idea is very simple, but the kids are tutoring each other, right? But the idea is you have to get tutored first. And so there's a variety of problems, there's a variety of situations. And this is not only with mathematics, but this is done with literacy and other kinds of domains. But kids are tutored on one particular problem or project, and then they tutor other kids. And the idea is that you give them enough just basic understanding and familiarity with one kind of topic, and they, as they tutor more and more kids in their class, they enhance their own understanding of the concept or of the topic, and they are able to teach it better, right? And so it's this really cool kind of idea that it capitalizes on the known research around tutoring, like one-on-one tutoring has the most learning gains possible, but also there's something really, just really cool about that work. The way Macy talks about it, like it's rooted in love. It's like a pedagogy of love. Like the kids really love doing that. Yeah, I mean, I'm in my own work, I'm constantly trying to encourage kids to talk to other kids. You know, it's like, oh, so-and-so was thinking about it slightly differently, right? Like maybe go ask them about it. And so, yeah, there's also complex instruction is a paradigm that was developed a number of years ago. And I still think there's people working on it. It's called complex instruction in mathematics. And part of that is looking at group-worthy problems and how do you support small groups of students in engaging in these open-ended, really kind of interesting math scenarios.
Okay, we are at time, but we have this one question left. It is up to you if you would like to engage with it. It's kind of a large question.
Large.
So will the current push to ban CRT in schools reiterate the surveillance of Black, Indigenous people of color under the white gaze?
Yes, it already has. It makes the work more difficult. When you have, like the work of teachers is already extraordinarily difficult. The work of teachers who are interested in integrating like social justice content or having any sort of critical approach to their teaching is also immensely difficult. It adds to the complexity. And so a lot of teachers had to learn, and I'm thinking of Rochelle Gutierrez's work, right? How to be creatively insubordinate and how to work around systems and how to work around administrators who are not supportive of, for example, talking about race and racism in a math class. And so now that you have a legislative ban in certain states that are confusing what critical race theory is, right? It is making it even more and more difficult for those teachers or for any teacher to take up these crucial topics in math, for example, or in any kind of like subject area. And so there's still a lot of work to be done around how do you address this? Like, how do we politically and socially address like what is happening, right, with these legislative bans? Like they're codifying in law, right? Like what is allowed and what is not allowed. when I think at the heart of what people are trying to do is they're just trying to present a more complete and accurate history of what is happening in the United States. So yeah, we'll see how things shake out.
All right, we peppered you with a whole bunch of really good questions. You're probably exhausted. So thank you very much, Dr. Gutierrez, for coming to talk to the education series. For those of you who are still left with us in real time, we would love if you filled out that evaluation form, but again, that's not required for you. If you are watching this video later for your UROP education series attendance requirement, please do go to the Undergraduate Research Education Series webpage, and at the top of the page, you'll find a link to that evaluation form. Please fill that out. That's how I can track that you watched this video